What about Bonnie's dog? A poetic journey into the return of mythic religion in liminal networks. Question: what's with the liminal folks becoming Christian? 1. What does the Christian turn signify? Terence McKenna, that charming, psychedelic, Whiteheadian pseudo-philosopher, once devised a typically dubious thought experiment known as the time wave. According to the time wave, temporality, time, etc., was not moving forward in a straight line. It was actually a self-similar, recursive, and accelerating fractal. Fractals endlessly repeat variants of the same patterns. In a fractal time wave, all the basic experiential vibes and underlying structures of history repeat themselves at all scales. Maybe you go through a brief Roman Empire in your late 30s. Maybe you have a Paleolithic era every morning at 6 a.m. This is a silly but provocative idea. If it were true, we would not be surprised to observe periodically resurgent waves of mythic traditionalism. A temporary surge of re-Christianization would be expected every so often. Even liminal, metamodern, integrative, and Game B communities would, provided they had some Christian cultural heritage, experience these occasional waves of return, and then the wave would pass. Yes, I expect the recent enthusiasm for Christianity to be a passing moment in our zeitgeist. But a statement like that comes built in with two important obviouslies. Or is that obvious lies? 1. Obviously, Christian communities still exist in great variety. For some groups and for some individuals, this is certainly not a fad. You can be wise, healthy, postmodern, and meta-crisis informed via any language, tradition, or symbolism. 2. Also obviously, resurgent mythic traditionalism is not limited to Christianity. Everything is back. Full retro living does not just mean a yen for faux 80s synth soundtracks, curing your own venison and wearing sexy steampunk pirate boots. It means we are continually recovering and giving new trans-ironic appreciation to all the aesthetics of history and prehistory, from metamodern Islam to liminal Zoroastrianism, from Proto-Indo-European magic to Toltec cults. The future contains more of the past than the past did, so let's not pretend this is just a resurgent Christian thing. Those were the two obviouslies. The less obviously is that we barely know what we mean by a phrase like mythic traditionalism. Are we even clear on what constitutes a myth? Does myth signify a debunked ideological fantasy like the myth of early retirement? Does it signify a prehistorical play of subconscious neurogenetic archetypes like the myth of Osiris? Or is it the pre-modern stereotypes that organize ethnic kingdom cultures around Piaget's concrete operational form of cognition, i.e. mythic membership societies? Does mythic tradition primarily point to patterns from 200 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 20,000? And to compound the problem, we do not base our observations on access to mythic traditions in their naturalized state. Theorists argue, for example, that mythic literalism is not ancient, but instead is a recent reaction to modernism. Maybe myth does not become asserted as fact until it is forced to compete with a dominant regime of scientific materialism. Modern education, family life, and media generate large numbers of folks who have values and identity feelings that resemble the pre-modern folk. However, these folks live differently from their ancestors. They are cut off from large sectors of the traditional organic life world and separated from the primary economic production patterns of the old mythic traditionalists. They are deceived on purpose by modern marketing and politics, confused by addictive electronic technology, and saturated with neurodisruptive chemical additives that modernity puts into their diet soda. So today's believers may not be good examples of mythic traditionalism. If you wanted to be a Chad of rad trads, i.e. to have conventional high status in a radical traditionalist world space today, you might not even know where to begin. For the purpose of this poetic essay, however, let us temporarily bracket this problem and speak vaguely enough to pretend we are all discussing the same thing. Let us say that by mythic traditionalism, we mean the allure of the popular inherited narratives, symbol sets, and social rituals that modern civilization calls the great religions. Things like recognizable costumes, axial age hierarchies, scriptural holy books, magical names, standardized deity images, politically recognized holidays, urban churches, and rural sentiments, all coupled with the nostalgic longing to return to the great project of cultivating a trans-tribal people through the enforced use of a shared story that is asserted independently of its historicity. or we could just call them the believers. 2. Bonnie's dog at the limits of reason. Sam Harris will lose, the process philosopher Benita Roy recently said aloud in my presence. She was tracking her own thoughts, sounding vaguely startled by them, on a couch in rural New York. Bonnie and I were there performing back-to-back workshops for the shadowy endemic group. In the evenings and at breakfast, we explored the possibility of a new divinity school, and we pondered Jordan Hall's recent conversion to old-school Christianity. And he wasn't the only one. Was Jesus making a comeback? Most of us in these liminal networks are not raised in families heavily saturated by conformist faith. It is mostly absent or merely perfunctory in the more educated and globalized sectors of the contemporary world. This can make us unnecessarily critical of the superficial foolishness and dangerous prejudices of old believers. It can also make us secretly envious and hungry for some secret realm of meaning we suspect them of possessing. We dimly sense the power of gods, messiahs, and religiously activated communities. That seems to be what the movie Dune is about. And we gaze upon the mythic traditionalists with a mixture of cautious anxiety and seductive intrigue. Yet as much as we yearn for their potent collective meaning, we also require such meanings to be much more pluralistic and chill. In his classic sci-fi novel, VALIS, Philip K. Dick's half-autobiographical protagonist, horse lover Fat, wrestles with an endlessly unfolding series of theological reinterpretations of his personal visionary encounter with God. Or was it a UFO? Or a hyperdimensional machine intelligence manufactured by the Soviets? Among us coherent pluralists and evolutionary multi-perspectivalists, it is a pleasure to see horse lover Fat entertaining alternative interpretations. Too many people seem to think they can bypass or quickly leap past postmodernism by affirming some benign mixture of science and religion. That is necessary, but not nearly enough. You also have to really go down the rabbit hole, down into contextualism and intertextuality. Any hasty attempt to escape radical relativism and pluralism will actually fail to discover the deep pathway beyond postmodernity, for the path passes down, deeper in and through. A metamodern Christianity only counts as metamodern and trans-nihilistic if it is authentically comfortable with alternative interpretations of itself and has a good conscience about the insurmountable chasm between reality, knowledge, and belief. But this is not entirely new. Many great mystics and prophets have struggled to awaken the naive believers of their own communities to the great mystery. Some prophets even agree with me that faith is, in a sense, the opposite of belief. Faith is a way of being with mystery and limitation, making it workable. Belief is a way of evading mystery by asserting the unlimited potency of hypersimplified cultural knowledge. Anyway, horse lover Fat's friends enjoy provoking him into profligate religious discursions. That's right, I said profligate religious discursions. There's no going back now. Fat's friends often vexatiously bring up two Philosophy 101 problems that typically confound Christian believers. How do you know you're right? And what about suffering? Typically, believers are not reasoned into their beliefs, any more than you get talked into being homosexual. And so they are on shaky ground when trying to cogently present convincing reasons for their feelings of certainty. And likewise, their strong feeling of virtue can become problematic when they are forced to confront all the ways in which their certainty makes them indifferent to the suffering of others. For example, horse lover Fat's friend Kevin constantly brings up his dead cat as a challenge to the existence and or goodness of God. The senseless death of Kevin's beloved feline and the deep pain it causes him is a visceral counter-argument against the notion of divine plan. If I ever meet God, he keeps saying, I'm going to whip out my dead cat and demand an answer. What about my cat? So, what about Kevin's cat? And while we're at it, what about Bonnie's dog? Bonnie told me that just before coming to the New York workshop, which she almost had to miss, her beloved dog was very sick. Possibly, she told me, as the result of an injudiciously swallowed duck egg. The poor beast was suffering, dysfunctional, and seemed to be literally on the edge of death. As a last-ditch tactic, reflecting both on her childhood habit of prayer and the recent spate of re-Christianizations in our communities, Bonnie prayed to Jesus. Hopefully she doesn't mind me telling you this. Prayer, by the way, is an interestingly different thing than meditation. Of course, there are so many types of each practice that distinctions blur, but generally speaking, they have different enactive biochemistries, gestural repertoires, and cultural framing. Prayer has a love-driven, passionate, petitionary, grateful, aspirational, exultant, and occult dimension that is typically absent from the psychologically oriented metacognitive practices and agnostic flow states of meditation. Amazingly, Bonnie's dog got better immediately. Stronger, healthier, praise Jesus. But what did it mean? Bonnie was chewing on all this during the workshop. How do our post-postmodern, post-metaphysical, trans-pluralistic, trans-rational, and integrative worldviews deal intelligently with prayer, miracles, and faith? By the way, the question of Bonnie's dog is not about magic. We could but won't delve into the nebulous discourse around possible or impossible mechanisms of non-local causality, higher dimensional laws, morphic resonance, psychogenic probability skewing, merging of intentionality into the ever-present origin. Maybe. But the point is not simply that sorcery occurred. The point is that the sorcery was mediated by the traditional symbolic and linguistic architecture of the post-Roman, post-Judaic, Western, and globalized world. Christianity. After the workshop, Bonnie's dog took a turn for the worse. Poor fellow. But that doesn't make the question of prayer go away, nor does it remove the problems of God, Christianity, and mythic traditionalism as sense-making tools. More importantly, it doesn't show us the requirements, vibes, and risks necessary to situate a mythic religion into metamodern space. 3. Cultural soul revival. The famous Danish existentialist Søren Kierkegaard complained that virtually no one who self-identified as a Christian was living according to Christ's instructions. They were not, he said, actual Christians. They were merely people born into the political and cultural arena of Christendom. Christendom is no longer a common word. I find it retro and delightful. Being more tolerant than Søren Kierkegaard, or any Dane for that matter, I tend to think that the esoteric instructions of great saints, yogis, and avataric shamans are not for the general community, and therefore I do not negatively judge that community as inauthentic. Regular people are busy. The self-consciously holy way of life is a rare specialization that need not be the heart of religion for most people. Folks need occasional access to spiritual specialists. They need a meaningful shared story and a set of ritual practices that help them grow toward health, strength, and self-worth by refining and acknowledging their participation in the beautiful dream of a living cultural field, Christendom. Another facet of my uniquely non-Danish tolerance: why does he keep picking on the Danes? Is it a joke to say you're tolerant by excluding someone? Is that I consider post-Christians to be a viable kind of Christian. And in the post-Christian household of my youth, we had two holy books, the King James Bible and the Tao Te Ching, the light and the way. In my home, religion was a free choice guided by personal instinct. We assumed religious indoctrination of children was a kind of psychological abuse. You shouldn't be having sex, getting high, or receiving cosmological myths when you're only 8 years old. Too soon. Personally, though, I was voracious for spirituality, religion, and mythology. I read the Gospels frequently. They appeared to contain coded instructions for the yogic transfiguration of consciousness. But as for Yeshua the Redeemer, i.e. Jesus, and the rest of the acclaimed historical symbolism, I initially felt nothing. My first emotional connection to Christian material did not come until adolescence, and it came through art. Image of Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali's mystical paintings depicted a holographic, surrealistic, and subatomic transformation of human beings into a transcendental Christ. They seemed to echo the teleological visions of Teilhard de Chardin. I fell in love with the kind of love that permeated his radioactive subconscious and interdimensional cathedrals. But then came Anne Rice. She wrote erotically charged, lushly detailed historical novels about immortal blood-drinking vampires. It was while reading her novel, Memnoch the Devil, that I first wept at a description of crucifixion. After that, I started to have delicious dreams about the apocalyptic transfiguration of the world featuring gospel characters. Oddly, though, many of these dreams seem to take place in Egypt centuries before the Christian era. Anne Rice wrote so well, actually, that she converted herself to Catholicism. I'd never heard of such a thing. Most of the intelligent and healthy people I knew as a child were moving away from mythic traditionalism. Then I learned that Canadian media philosopher Marshall McLuhan had also converted. They both viewed mythic Christian universalism as the great inheritance of European culture, a transnational infrastructure for humanist mystic populism that included Da Vinci, Mozart, Galileo, and Gothic cathedrals. Their souls, I thought, were sniffing around for the normative and organized role-playing that enacts the background spirit of a civilization. So it looked to me as though these smart, soulful, leading-edge people were doing cultural soul revival. And why not? The archaic shamans helped individuals to recover lost, wounded, or immature fragments of the personal self. Perhaps a similar process is needed at the cultural level. And for many people, that means rediscovering, revaluing, and experientially exploring Christianity. Many of us may still need to integrate material that is stored for us in so-called Christian spaces. Unlike Kierkegaard, that judgmental bastard, I view the religions of tomorrow as having both a right hand and a left hand. That's a way of saying we need both a deeper, healthier, and smarter enactment of inherited traditions, right hand, and new attempts at unfolding religiousness from within the current technological, ecological, and informational landscape, left hand. These approaches are and should be profoundly complementary. The problems facing our species require all hands on deck. We need certain things provided by religiousness, for example, meaning-making, mass mobilization, cultural confidence. And we need them to be smart, healthy, humanistic, evolutionary, and cooperative with each other. And this can all look like tradition just as much as it can look like secularism or new religious movements. We're all in the same boat. Actually, doing this in traditional forms has a special advantage. It helps you to sympathetically understand conservatives and traditionalists. That's usually a big emotional blind spot for progressives, liminalists, metamoderns, and other so-called leading-edge folk. The right and the old are still the majority on this planet. They're not going away. Deep dialogue, deep empathy, and good humor must open us to and within these communities. And doing your metamodern religion in the format of mythic traditionalism is a great way to attempt such an important task. At least for a while. Anne Rice deconverted after a few years and has since striven to distance herself from organized Christianity. It's Bonnie's dog all over again. 4. Communitarian mysticism on the spectrum. We all miss out on things. No childhood is fully comprehensive. Yet certain forms of play are classic, and if we miss them, we may need to revisit them later. Jordan Peterson has a theory that many young adults slip into socially normalized gender dysmorphia because they miss out on basic opportunities for imagination-driven sexual role-playing. Barbie and Ken, Blue and Pink, playing house. Digital machines, he says, have begun to substitute themselves for children's imagination, and our homes have become seething hives of anxiety about stereotypical gender roles, leading, of course, to adults who attempt to undertake remedial gender play with radical surgery and hormone replacements. Okay, stop thinking about those wonderful trannies. It's not about them. In fact, that whole issue is already outdated. Gender switching and cross-dressing are painfully tame experiments compared to the laboratory restructuring of human genetics and the public distribution of tools for inventing whole new species. Those are already happening, Gorge. The reason I brought this up was to consider a religious analogy to Dr. Peterson's intriguing notion. Despite his provocative social function as the prejudiced old man yelling at the world's transgender kids to get off his lawn, he might nonetheless be pointing to an interesting partial truth. If adults have to undertake imaginal re-authenticating explorations to make up for missed gender play in childhood, then maybe we also have to make up for missed religious and mythic community role-playing. The Christian conversions we're seeing do not typically involve people who left mythic communities and are now going back. Arguably, those folks, putting aside the question of trauma, already satisfied their childhood need for mystic communitarian dress-up. But the urban, liberal, and agnostic electronic elites might not have gotten their opportunities yet. They may need to go back. And for people on the spectrum, who perhaps evaded mythic traditionalism because in childhood they were too narrowly focused on reason, systems, and machines, at the expense of social cues, poetry, broken hearts, and nonlinear instincts, they might now be maturing into the recognition of their need for such experiences. And who knows, maybe such people need that exploration to be safe, clear, rules-based, dogmatic instructions do resemble algorithms in a certain way. Hell, we should have been predicting that Jordan Hall would take his family back to Christ. It's all so obvious now. But whether we look at this Christian return through the personal lens of technical and secular individuals doubling back from missed experiences of mystical communitarianism, or whether we look at it through the collective lens of public nostalgia for a unifying narrative, either way we need to be thinking not just about validating its putative meta-modernity, but also about preparing for an imminent age of irrationality, trans-rationality, and quasi-rationality. 5. The inevitable collapse of the modern information landscape. I gave a presentation in early 2023 called The Age of Sorcery Begins. An obvious topic, right? It can hardly have escaped your notice that our machines are now telepathic, quasi-intelligent mind readers capable of nudging us toward various beliefs and behaviors and skewing the outcomes of history. You and I already exist in a world where all audio and video recordings and apparent reference materials can be rapidly generated by massively distributed digital tools. Anyone with a voice can request the machine demons to generate new software, new facts, or convincing arguments. You do not have to be a programmer anymore. Someone can call you and sound and look like your daughter, or have their digital assistant do it for them. The mainstream technological world is running like magic. In fact, we've been in the age of sorcery since marketing started to run the global economy in the 1930s. Marketing is controlling reality by controlling desire, by controlling human minds through the manipulation of symbols. Magic. Marshall McLuhan, who I mentioned earlier, taught that digital technology would revive many pre-modern patterns, from feudal oligarchy to mythic role-playing. Part of that is beautiful, a re-enchantment, a return to right-left balance, the constructive interblending of reason and imagination in public ritual. Okay, good. But at the same time, there is regression, superstition, and unreasonable destruction. At the inaugural Respond event in a monastery in Vermont, I was part of a team with Steve March and Rafe Kelly when our collective hive mind suddenly veered into pondering a pragmatic response to emergent mass superstition, ontological anxiety, and public manipulation by automated egregores. We saw together that new wisdom culture needs an urgent return to the task of producing helpful psychotechnologies, talismans, protective mantras, magical safe zones for regular folks in a world spinning out of informational control. What if the public mindset during COVID was just the beginning? Our coming mystical age is not likely to be the rational egalitarian utopia envisioned by our liberal modernist ancestors. The whole notion of an informed public consensus enacted through rational agents and trustworthy institutions seems to be dissolving. Open society and public reason may become an elite affair that will soon exist only behind gated walls. We may be facing the choice between a better or worse age of superstition. Daniel Pinchbeck has been pointing toward a restoration of the irrational, but this trend has been going on for a while. Is anyone old enough to remember when U.S. President Ronald Reagan and his wife were getting policy advice from astrologers? How many other political and corporate leaders have been and still are drawing on occult or religious sources? And are they doing it well or poorly? Transrational or pre-rational? Are their oracles healthy or unhealthy? The arc of history is not bending away from human irrationality. A flood of cults is coming, powered by psychedelics, AI persuasion tools, and a global sense of mass uncanniness. The tactics of sane civilization may therefore have to pivot from teaching and enforcing anti-irrationalism toward cultivating a better class of irrationalism. And there are two great precursors to such a task. Firstly, the pragmatic prehistoric shamans. Let's not forget them, but forget about them for now. Secondly, the great mythic traditional networks that attempted to take over and organize human superstition. To this day, we still watch horror movies where the only way to exorcise a demon is to petition the Jesuit bureaucracy, whose magical book-based super spells trump all other forms of supernatural power. That's how successful they were in stabilizing a structure atop a sea of magical thinking. A pragmatic futurist today might want to start getting a visceral knowledge of Christian and not only Christian tactics for organizing low-information irrational populations. But this can be done in ways that conform to the needs and insight patterns of emerging metamodern and integrative culture, or it can be done in ways that don't. Speaking of Daniel Pinchbeck and strange teams, here's a picture of St. Daniel the Stylite, great name, superimposed over the image of a necklace with a naked female Jesus on it. How does that make you feel? And what if that feeling characterizes the next 500 years? 6. Meta-Christianity. Integral Christianity, Christian process theology, metamodern Christianity, kenosis qua kensho. Bonus points if you get that one. What are the possibilities for a coherent, pluralist Christian agnosticism with a developmental twist? And what sorts of meta-theologians and meta-priests will be needed to help cultivate such a phenomenon? The first temptation is to introduce an emergent sequence of improving versions of Christianity. Why not? The Jewish prophets of the Old Testament seem to have argued with their vengeful God until he became the loving parental deity of the Gospels. The Bible already includes an evolutionary upgrade. Maybe more are possible. It might help to clarify a series of covenants by which Christianity could appear more analogous to level-like models of emergent cognitive, social, and computational complexity. Brendan Graham Dempsey is proposing something like this, and of course Ken Wilber famously introduced his conveyor belt model, by which mythic traditions could striate into different styles and allow for developmental flow-through. I'm not opposed to these. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I even favor them. However, I am interested in what I consider to be two essential components that will determine whether an approach to Christianity or to any mythic religion is capable of being metamodern, liminal, second tier, etc. These two are A, the presence of a trained, healthy, and valued natural set of priests and priestesses both within the tradition and between the traditions, and B, a framing attitude toward faith that allows it to meet and exceed both modern rationality and the postmodern gap between reality and knowledge. Let's begin with the second point first. I am an atheist, but a Christian atheist. Slavoj Žižek. My own journey with Christianity is full of strange reversals and curious conjunctions. In some ways, I do feel like a rad trad, a radical traditionalist, but from my vantage point, anything more recent than 6,000 years is newfangled progressive nonsense. I do not relate to Christianity as traditional, nor was it encouraged at me in my youth. But I grew up with a Bible in the house. I've written 2 books about Jesus, and I've done as much as anybody to encourage deeper, wiser, and more nuanced discussions in which Christians feel welcomed into the complexities of the developmental leading edge. In fact, I think we should do a lot more to make people feel welcome to explore and share the depth-oriented aspects of the mystical communities and mythic traditions with which they feel resonant. Christians can often be accused correctly of trying to impose a hegemony by pretending they are marginalized victims under cultural assault. Beyond that disingenuous reactive posturing, however, is an actual problem of their real exclusions. Liminal, integrative, and metamodern communities need to be warmer and more curious about people's mythic engagements. And yet we also have to bring a challenge to all of this. For me, that challenge is summed up in the phrase, I absolutely do not care if Jesus existed. I love Christians and Christ. I've been blessed by and transformed in Christian churches. I appreciate the potential of a narrative language games, and I expect Christian symbols to play a role in establishing sacred civilization in the face of the meta-crisis. For me, though, none of that is connected to the acceptance or assertion of any historical fact. It is unbelievably irrelevant whether there was a Jesus or what kind of Jesus there was. Christianity works anyway. This attitude is an example of informed, deep post-modernity. Mythic religious traditions must enfold both the modern challenge, taking science, progress, and humanist education seriously, and the postmodern challenge, individuality, relativity, contextuality, multiple valid networks, and the sensations of realism. For me, the phrase, it doesn't matter if Jesus existed, is a way of foregrounding the fact that metamodern mythic Christianity has to be liberated from fixation on any particular historical interpretation. It has to embrace the plurality and integratively affirm the perspectival chasm between knowledge and reality. Faith is no longer the assertion that reality is perfectly mapped by your group's metaphysical statements. Faith is no longer certain. Instead, as it was for many great mystics, it is the confidence that your opaque, indirect, and sliding access to reality is deeply okay. The test here is whether reason and relativism aggressive assertionism. But any Christianity strong enough to incorporate these thresholds is welcome to the space of meta-religion. These developmental integrations, though, require healthy, anti-fragile, full-spectrum, interperspectival, developmental, trans-pluralistic, and non-dual Christianity, which requires good people to cultivate it, good gardeners of souls. We need theologians who can articulate Christianity at this level. We need priests and priestesses who can enact rituals and mysticism in a manner that comports with the emerging civilization. And those new healthy Christian religious philosophers and ritual servants require, in turn, intelligent non-oppressive training from a trans-religious source that tweaks and educates variations of all faiths. So there must be a growth, training, and promotion of meta-theological and meta-priestly expertise. Who can help priests of any religion to be better at their tasks? Who can help theologians of any religion to outperform their predecessors in virtue, wisdom, and health? The question of whether we get a healthy metamodern Christianity or any other mythic religion, rather than a pseudo-Christian regressive symptom of the cultural and informational disturbance of our epoch, comes down in many ways to this. Can we identify, train, and empower the transcultural, trans-tribal, and trans-ideological shamanoids to maturely assist the representatives of all value systems, symbol systems, and worldviews in a benevolent, non-invasive promulgation of developmentally friendly, skill-based, and ecologically aligned customs of cultural empowerment, virtue training, and meaning-making? Praise the Lord. Unless, of course, the situation is much weirder than even I have yet hinted.